He stared at the gray toilet, just inches from Steve Vernon's knee, and reddened with embarrassment. Dropping his pants, Chris sat down and tried not to think about what he was doing. You be posting this on Facebook and then be doing this in real life. But that's none of my business. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. So, we're doing reading 12 today, and let me find where we landed. Let me find where we ended. Nah, that was funny. Okay. Confused, Chris looked from Jordan to Selena. "Wait," he said. "Don't you want me to tell you what really happened?" Jordan flipped his pad to a new blank page. "Actually," he said, "I don't." And that's where we ended. I'm going to have some coffee really quickly, and then we will get started. Can you see the steam coming from it? Maybe? No? Well, it's that hot. This is so good. It is 6:30. I don't know. Y'all probably can't see that. It's 6:30 a.m. So this coffee is like amazing right now. I don't want to put it down. I really need to get moving though, huh? Can't just stare off in his face the entire time. Anyways, okay. That afternoon, Chris got a cellmate. Shortly before dinner, he'd been curled up on his bunk, his thoughts pulled close around him, when an officer brought the man in. He was wearing a jumpsuit and sneakers like everyone else, but there was something different about him, something removed and standoffish. He nodded at Chris and climbed into the top bunk. Hector came to the cell door. "Get tired of seeing your own face, man?" "Get lost, Hector," the man sighed without turning over. "Don't you be telling me to get lost, you..." "Chow," an officer called. As Hector left to get into his cell for lockdown, the man unfolded himself from the bunk and came down to accept his tray. Chris, on the bottom bunk, realized there was nowhere for the other guy to sit. If he crawled back into the top bunk, he'd have to eat lying down. "You, can sit here," he said, glancing at the far end of his bunk. "Thanks." The man uncovered his tray. An appetizing tricolored lump sat in the center. "Name's Steve Vernon. Chris Hart." Steve nodded and began to eat. Chris noticed that Steve was not much older than he was, and seemed just as inclined to stay uninvolved. "Hey, Hart," Hector called from his own cell. "You better sleep with your eyes open tonight. Youngsters ain't safe around him." Chris's gaze flew to Steve, who was still methodically eating. This was the guy who'd killed a baby? Chris forced his attention back to his plate, trying to remember that a man was innocent until proven guilty. He was proof of that. All the same, Chris remembered the things Hector had said when they passed the isolation cell. "Picked up his kid in the middle of the night and went crazy, man. Shook him so hard to stop crying his neck snapped. Who knew what set someone like that off? Who knew what set someone like that off?" I don't understand that. Okay. Chris's insides went to jelly. He set his plate down and started for the door of the cell, intending to head for the bathroom at the end of the hall. But it was locked down for another half hour at least, and for the first time since his arrival, he did not have the cell to himself. He stared at the gray toilet, just inches from Steve Vernon's knee, and reddened with embarrassment. Dropping his pants, Chris sat down and tried not to think about what he was doing. He kept his arms crossed over his middle, his gaze on the floor. He finished and stood to find Steve in the upper bunk again, his half-cleaned plate on the lower bed. Vernon's face was turned away from the toilet, toward the bare wall, offering Chris as much dignity as possible. Coffee break. All right. The telephone rang just as Michael was getting ready to leave for a house call. "Hello?" he asked impatiently, his body already beginning to sweat beneath the weight of his winter jacket. "Oh, Mikey," said his cousin Phoebe from California, the only person who ever called him Mikey. "I just wanted to call and tell you how very, very sorry I am." He had never liked Phoebe. She was his aunt's child. She must have been alerted by his own mother after the funeral, since Michael had done no calling around of his own to let relatives know of Emily's death. She wore her hair in hot ashberry braids and had made a career out of throwing pots that were intentionally lopsided. When Michael spoke to her, which was infrequently at family gatherings, he was reminded of the time they'd been four, and she'd snickered when he wet his pants. "Phoebe," he said, "thanks for calling." "Your mother told me," she added, which Michael found interesting. How could his mother pass along information that Michael could not yet accept? "I thought you might want to talk." "To you?" Michael almost asked, before he remembered himself. And then he recalled that Phoebe's common-law husband had hanged himself from a closet rod 2 years ago. "I know what it's like," Phoebe continued, suddenly discovering something you should have noticed a long time ago. "They go on to this better place, you know, which is what they wanted all along. But you and me, we're still left behind with all the questions they couldn't answer." Michael remained silent. Was she still grieving, then, after 2 years? Was she suggesting that he had anything at all in common with her? He closed his eyes and felt himself shiver in spite of his heavy coat. It wasn't true. It simply wasn't true. He had not known Phoebe's husband, but she couldn't have known him as well as he had known Emily. So well, Michael thought, that this would come out of the blue. He felt a stab of pain in his chest and realized that guilt came from all angles. From not being able to see his daughter's distress in the first place, from being so selfish that even now he focused on what Emily's suicide said about his parenting skills and not about Emily herself. "What do I do?" he murmured, unaware he'd spoken aloud until he heard Phoebe's answer. "You survive," she said. "You do what they couldn't." On the other end of the telephone, Phoebe sighed. "You know, Michael, I used to sit around looking for a way to make sense of what happened, like there was some kind of answer I could find if I could just look hard enough. Then one day I realized that if there had been one, Dave would still be here. And I wondered if this feeling that I couldn't figure it all out was what Dave had been feeling too." She cleared her throat. "I still don't get why he did it, and I don't like that he did it, but at least I understand a little better what was going through his head." Michael imagined Emily's stomach tied up in the same Gordian knots as his own, Emily's thoughts equally tangled, and he wished for the millionth time that he'd been vigilant enough to have spared her such pain. He murmured his thanks to Phoebe again and hung up the phone. Then, still wearing his shearling coat, he trudged upstairs in the empty house. He entered Emily's room and stretched out on the bed, staring in turn at the mirror, the school books, the discarded clothing, as he tried to see the world through his daughter's eyes. Francis Cassavetes has been sentenced to 6 months in jail, but he was serving it on weekends. It was a common punishment for those who were employed and contributing to society. A judge would have them come into the jail on Friday and leave on Sunday, allowing them to work the rest of the days in between. Weekenders were visiting royalty in the jail, and spent most of their serving time taking bribes from inmates less fortunate in their sentencing. They smuggled in cigarettes, needles, Tylenol, anything for a price. When Francis entered the maximum security pod, he cupped Hector's face in his hands. "Am I your man?" he said. He pushed past Hector, heading toward the John. Francis returned, his hand fisted around something. You owe me double for this, Hector. Fucking things made me bleed. Chris watched as Hector's hand brushed Francis's and a small white tube winked in the transfer. He turned and walked back into his cell. Steve folded down a corner of the magazine he was reading. Francis brought him cigarettes again? I guess, Chris said. Steve shook his head. Hector ought to ask for a nicotine patch instead. He muttered. Probably easier for Francis to smuggle in, too. How does he? Chris asked, curious. Smuggle them in. Used to hide them in his mouth, I hear. But he got caught, so now he's using a different opening. When Chris continued to stare at him blankly, Steve shook his head. How many holes have you got? He asked pointedly. Chris turned bright red. Steve rolled away and opened his magazine again. Jesus fucking Christ, he muttered. How the hell did you get in here? As soon as Chris entered the room with its long, scarred tables and collection of inmates and relatives, he saw his mother. She threw her arms around him as he reached her. Chris, she sighed, smoothing his hair the way she had when he was a little boy. You're okay? The officer gently tapped his mother on the shoulder. Ma'am, he said, you'll have to let go now. Startled, Gus released her son and sat down. Chris settled across from her. There was no plexiglass window between them, but that did not mean there wasn't a barrier. He could have told his mother that, in the superintendent's rule book, a binder as big as a dictionary, it was decreed that a visit could begin with a brief embrace or kiss, not open-mouthed, and end the same way. In this same binder were the rules against possession of cigarettes, against use of profanity, against pushing another inmate. Such slight infractions in the real world were, in jail, a felony. The punishment was time added to one's sentence. Gus reached across the table and took Chris's hand. For the first time, he noticed that his father was there, too. James sat with his chair back a bit, as if he was afraid to come in contact with the table. It brought him nearly up against the inmate, with a tattoo of the spider web on his left cheek. It's so good to see you, his mother said. Chris nodded and ducked his head. If he said what he wanted to, that he needed to go home, that he'd never seen anything more beautiful than her right now all his life, he would burst into tears, and he could not afford to do that. God only knew who was listening, how it would be held against him. We brought you some money, Gus said, holding out an envelope stuffed with bills. If you need more, you can call us. She handed the envelope to Chris, who immediately signaled an officer and asked him to put it in his prison account. So, his mother said. So. She looked into her lap, and he almost felt pity. There was nothing to talk about, really. He had spent all week sitting in a maximum security pod at the county jail, and his parents would not consider that sanctioned conversation. You'll get a chance next week to be moved into the medium level, no? James's voice startled him. Yeah, Chris said. I have to petition the classification board. A silence fell. The swim team won its meet against Littleton yesterday, Gus said. Oh? Chris tried to sound like he gave a damn. Who swam my race? I'm not sure. Robert, Rick, Rich, something. Richardson. Chris scuffed his sneaker against the floor. Probably had a crappy time. He listened to his mother tell him about the history assignment Kate had received, for which she'd be dressing up as a colonial woman. He listened to her talk of the movies that were playing at the local theater, and of her trip to the AAA to find the quickest route between Bainbridge and Grafton. And he realized that this was how they would fill these visiting hours for the next 9 months. Not with Chris discussing horrors he did not even want his parents to know of, but with his mother painting for him the world he had left behind. His attention was captured as his mother cleared her throat. So, she said, have you met anyone? Chris snorted. This isn't the Christmas social, he said, and immediately realized his mistake when his mother, red-faced, looked into her lap. He was amazed for an instant at how alone he really was. Unable to blend in with the inmates because of who he had been. Unable to blend in with his parents because of who he currently was. James glared at his son. Apologize, he said tersely. Your mother is having a very difficult time with this. And if I don't, Chris shot back, what are you going to do to me? Throw me in prison? Christopher, James warned. But Gus cut him off by placing her hand on his arm. "It's all right," she soothed. "He's upset." She reached across the table and took Chris's hand. He remembered, just like that, being a toddler, how she would tell him that they were in a parking lot or a busy street, then reach down to grasp his fingers. He remembered the smell of rubber on asphalt and the lumbering tug of machinery rolling past, and how safe he had felt in spite of it, as long as he could feel her hand covering his. "Mom," Chris said, his voice breaking, "don't do this to me." Before he could cry, he stood, summoning an officer. "Wait," Gus exclaimed. "We still have 20 minutes left." "To do what?" Chris said softly. "Sit here and wish we weren't?" He leaned across the table and awkwardly embraced her. "You call us, Chris," Gus whispered, "and I'll see you Tuesday night." Those were the next visiting hours scheduled for the maximum security division. "Tuesday," Chris confirmed. Then he turned to his father. "But I don't want you to come." Ooh. Then he turned to his father and said, "But I don't want you to come." Ooh. I mean, at least he's honest. Hold on, I need more coffee. Un momento, por favor. Necesito café. Necesito más café. That afternoon, the temperature dropped to 0. The exercise courtyard was empty, the weather having driven everyone else away. Chris stepped outside, his breath fogging a path before him. He walked around the courtyard once and noticed Steve Vernon leaning against the brick wall. "Two guys went over there last year," Steve said, nodding toward the high corner where the razor wire met the brick building. "Officer went too close to the door to the exercise room, and bam, they were gone." "Did they get away?" Steve shook his head. "Caught them 2 hours later, right on Route 10. Chris smiled. Anyone dumb enough to stay on the main thoroughfare after skipping out of jail deserved to be caught. "Do you ever think of doing that?" Chris asked, jumping the fence. Steve exhaled through his nose, a white cloud. "No." "No?" Nothing out there for me to run back to," he said. Chris swung his head around. "How come you were in isolation?" "I didn't want to be around the other guys." "Are you really in here because you shook your kid to death?" Steve's eyes narrowed the slightest bit, but held Chris's. "Are you really in here," he said evenly, "because you killed your girlfriend?" Chris immediately thought of Jordan McAfee's warning, that the jail was full of snitches. He looked away, stamped his feet, and blew on his hands to warm them up. "Cold," he stated. "Yeah." "You want to go in?" Steve shook his head. Chris leaned back against the brick wall, aware of the body heat of the man beside him. "I'm not ready yet either," he said. Just after dinner, there was a shakedown. It happened once a month, at the decree of the superintendent. The officers would canvass the cells, tossing mattresses and pillows, sticking their hands into spare clothing and discarded shoes in hopes of finding something incriminating. Chris and Steve stood outside the bars, watching their small square of privacy being violated. The officer, a fat man, suddenly stood up, clutching something in his hand. He pointed to the sneakers on the floor. Chris had been sleeping barefoot when they entered. "Whose are these?" "Mine," Chris said. "Why?" The officer unrolled his sausage fingers one by one. In the middle of his palm was a fat, white cigarette. "That's not mine," Chris said, clearly stunned. The officer looked from Chris to Steve. "Save it for the DR," he said. As the guard left, Chris righted his bed and crawled back into the bunk. "Hey," Steve said, shaking his shoulder, "I didn't plant it." "Go away. I'm just telling you." Chris buried his head beneath the pillow, but not before seeing the flash of Hector's grin as he passed by the cell. In the 18 hours that passed between the finding of the cigarette and Chris's official disciplinary review, he fit together all the pieces of the puzzle. Hector had parted with one of his precious bootleg prizes because he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Test Chris, the newcomer, for his loyalties, and fuck over Steve, the baby killer. If Chris ratted out Hector, he'd regret it for some time. If he pinned the blame on Steve, who, as his cellmate, would have the best opportunity to plant a cigarette in Chris's sneaker, Chris would align himself with Hector's crowd. An officer led Chris to the small room where the assistant superintendent worked. Inside was the officer who'd wrecked the cell, and the assistant superintendent himself, a beefy man more suited to coaching football than pushing paper at a jail. Chris stood very straight while the assistant superintendent read a formal charge and advised him of his rights. "So, Mr. Hart," the man said, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" "Yes. Ask me to smoke it." The assistant superintendent raised his brows. "I can't imagine you'd like anything better." "I don't smoke," Chris said. "This'll prove it." "It will prove that you can fake a cough," the man said. "I don't think so. Now, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Chris thought of Hector. Chris thought of Hector and his razor-bladed pen. He thought of Steve, with whom he'd reached a tentative truce. And he remembered what he had been told about minor transgressions in jail. This cigarette could add 3 to 7 years to his sentence, if he was convicted. Then again, that was a big if. "No," Chris said quietly. "No?" He looked the assistant superintendent in the eye. "No," Chris repeated. The officers looked at each other and shrugged. "You're aware," the assistant superintendent said, "that if you feel we are missing any part of the story, you can suggest we speak to another inmate." "I know," Chris said, "but you don't have to." The man pursed his lips. "All right, Mr. Hart, based on the evidence, you've been found guilty of possession of an illegal substance in your cell, and you are sentenced to a 5-day lockdown. You'll remain in a cell for 23 hours of the day, with 1 hour free to shower." The superintendent nodded at the officers who escorted Chris from the room. He walked silently through the maximum security pod, collecting his things without speaking a word to anyone. It was not until he was being led to his new cell that Chris realized he would sit there until Thursday. 2 days too late for his mother to visit. 2 days too late for the classification board to transfer him to medium security. Chris slept during those days. He dreamed often of Emily, the touch and taste of her, of kissing her, tongue deep, and having her push something into his mouth, something small and hard like a peppermint candy. But when he spit it into his hand, he saw it for what it really was, the truth. He did sit-ups, endless numbers of them, because it was the only exercise he had room for in the narrow cell. During showers, he scrubbed until his skin went pink and raw, just so that he'd get his full hour out. He relived swim races, nights with M, class lectures, until his cell became uncomfortably full of memories, and he started to understand why inmates did not bother thinking of what they had left behind. He did not call his mother, of course, and on Tuesday he wondered whether she had come all the way to Woodsville just to be told her son was in a disciplinary lockdown. He also wondered who had been moved to medium security. Steve would have petitioned the classification board that day. On Thursday morning, he banged on the bars as soon as breakfast was finished and told an officer he wanted to be moved. "You will be," the officer said, "soon as we get a chance." They didn't get a chance until 4 o'clock that afternoon. An officer opened the door of the cell and led the way to the other maximum security pod, the one he'd been in the previous week. "Welcome home, Hart," he said. Chris dumped his few belongings on the lower bunk. To his surprise, a figure curled out of the upper one. "Hey," Steve said. "What are you doing here?" Steve laughed. "I was going to head out to a bar, but I couldn't find my car keys." "I meant that I thought you'd be upstairs by now." They both looked at the ceiling of the cell as if it was possible to see medium security, with its yellow cinder block walls, its horseshoe day room, its spacious showers. Steve shrugged, not saying what Chris knew he was thinking, that following the discovery of the cigarette, anyone in the jail would have pointed a finger at Steve, although Chris had chosen not to. "Changed my mind," he said. "You get more room upstairs, but 3 more guys in your cell." Three more? Steve nodded. "I figured I'd wait until I knew someone else up there." Chris lay back on his bunk and closed his eyes. After all this time, he liked hearing the sound of another person's voice, another person's thoughts. "Tuesday's coming around soon again," he said. He heard Steve sigh. "That it is," he answered. "Maybe we'll go." The funny thing was, Chris had become a hero. By not ragging on Hector about the cigarette when he perfectly well could have, he'd been elevated to the level of a worthy inmate, one who was willing to take the punches for someone else, no matter how undeserving that someone was. My man, Hector now called him. Chris was allowed to decide from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. what channel the TV stayed on. In the exercise room, he was given time on the weight bench. It was on the way back from the exercise room one day that Hector cornered him in the dark curve of the stairwell, the place that the cameras couldn't see. Shower, he hissed, 10:15. And what the hell was that supposed to mean? Chris spent the rest of the day wondering if he had been issued an appointment to get the shit kicked out of himself, or if Hector had some other agenda for needing to meet him in private. He waited until 10, then grabbed his towel and walked down the small cubicle at the end of the pod. There was no one else there. Shrugging, Chris stripped and turned on the water. He stepped into the stall and had just begun to lather up with soap when Hector peered over the edge. What the fuck is up with you? Chris blinked water from his eyes. You told me to be here, he said. I didn't tell you to shower, he said. Actually, he had. But Chris wasn't about to point that out. He shut off the water, only to have Hector snake an arm inside the stall and turn it on again. Leave it, he said. It hides the smoke. Then he drew from his jumpsuit a Bic pen that had been burned down into a curve and stretched at one end to make a small tobacco bowl. He unfolded a small square of paper and shook something precious into the makeshift pipe, then quickly flared a forbidden lighter. Here, he said, drawing deeply. Chris wasn't stupid enough to turn down hospitality from Hector. He bent his head away from the thin trickle of water and inhaled, exploding in a fit of coughing. It was not a cigarette. That much was true. But it didn't have the sweet taste of pot either. What is this? He asked. Banana peels, Hector said. Damon and me burned them down. He took the pipe and tamped it down. For a jar of coffee, I'll make you a packet. Chris felt the water run cold down the back of his neck. We'll see, he said, taking the pipe again when Hector offered it. You know, college boy, Hector said, I had you figured all wrong. Chris didn't respond. He fit his lips over the edge of the pipe, inhaled, and was not altogether surprised to find that this time it came naturally. A banana, what? Banana peels? Is that code for something? Does anyone know? Banana peels. We burn them down. I'm gonna have to look that up because I'm curious about that. Hold on. Banana peels. Yeah, that's what it says. Damon and me burn them down. Okay, yeah, I want to know what that is. Or if it's actually banana peels. On Saturday morning, Chris was one of the first inmates taken down to meet their visitors. Unlike the last time his mother had come to the jail, she was standing painfully erect, fury and fear crackling around her like electric currents that Chris could see even this far off. She folded Chris into her arms, and for the briefest moment he had the sense that years had fallen away, that he was once again smaller and weaker than she was. What happened? She said tightly. I come here on Tuesday to find out that I can't see you because you are serving some kind of disciplinary sentence. And when I ask what it is, they tell me it means you are locked inside some cage for 24 hours a day. 23, Chris said. You get an hour to shower. Gus leaned closer, her lips white. What did you do? She whispered. I was set up, Chris murmured. One of the other prisoners was trying to get me in trouble. He was what? Shocked, Gus sat back heavily. And you just went along with it? Chris felt 2 flags of color rise in his cheeks. He planted a cigarette in my sneaker, one that the officers found when they tossed the cell. And yeah, I went along with it because sitting by myself for 5 days was better than having this guy come at me with the knife he made out of a razor blades. Gus pressed her fist against her mouth, and Chris wondered what words she was trying to hold inside. There has to be someone I can talk to, she said finally. I'll go to the superintendent when I leave here today. This isn't the way a jail is supposed to be run, and... How would you know? Chris shook his head. "Don't go fighting my battles for me," he said wearily. "You're not like all of these criminals," Gus said. "You're just a child." At that, Chris's head snapped up. "No, Mom, I'm not a child. I'm old enough to be tried as an adult, old enough to serve time in adult jail." He looked past her. "Don't make me into something I'm not," he said, his words laid like a frank hand of cards on the table between them. On Saturday night, there was a terrible windstorm, and even the solid cement walls of the jail seemed to creak and threaten. Lockdown was late on weekends, 2 a.m., with most of the inmates rowdier than usual. Chris had not yet cultivated the art of sleeping like a log when the rest of the pod was animated and noisy. But he lay in his bunk with a pillow over his head, wondering if it was truly possible to hear the sound of the rain soaking into the bricks and whipping the ceiling. There had been a fight earlier, an argument about whether to watch Saturday Night Live or Mad TV, which had resulted in 2 cells being locked down for an hour, the inmates screaming at each other through the bars. Steve had watched TV for a while, then come into the cell and crawled into the upper bunk. Chris had been feigning sleep, but he listened to Steve rip open the wrapper of the nutrageous bar he purchased from the commissary that week. He'd gotten Chris some stuff too, M&Ms and coffee, and Twinkies. Because of the disciplinary sentence, Chris had missed the commissary order day, and he supposed this was Steve's way of thanking him for not being a snitch. After a while, there was no more wrestling in the upper bunk, and Chris realized Steve had fallen asleep. He waited until the officers called for lockdown, and then listened to the slap of rubber thongs on the floor, the soft sound of someone pissing in a urinal, the gradual slouch toward quiet. Lights out. The lights actually never went out. They dimmed considerably, but then again it was so dreary in the maximum security section that it took just as much time to get adjusted to seeing during the daytime as it did to sleeping in the shadows. Chris listened for that wind, imagining that he was outside in the middle of a field so big that he couldn't see any of its boundaries. The rain would run over him, and he'd lift his face into it, and all he would see was sky. There was a whimper, and then another. Chris smacked the flat of his hand against the upper bunk. He'd done that once or twice before when Steve was snoring. But instead of hearing the other man roll over and settle into sleep, there was a sharp, keening cry. He got out of bed and stood up as Steve began thrashing back and forth on his bunk, chest convulsing with sobs. Stunned into immobility for a moment, Chris watched. Steve's eyes were closed. His breathing labored. He was clearly upset, and he was just as clearly still asleep. At the second cry, Chris clamped his hand on Steve's shoulder. He shook a little harder, and in the dim light of the jail, he saw the silver slits of Steve's eyes. Steve shrugged off Chris's hand, and he felt himself flush with embarrassment. The cardinal rule of jail was that you did not touch someone unless you were expressly asked to. "Sorry," he mumbled. "You were having a nightmare." At that, Steve blinked. "I was?" "You were crying out and everything," Chris said, hesitating. "I didn't think you wanted to wake up the whole place." Steve slipped out of the upper bunk. He walked around Chris and sat down on the closed toilet, cradling his head in his hands. "Shit," he said. Chris sank onto his bunk. In the distance, he could still hear the whistle of the wind. "You should go back to sleep." Steve lifted his gaze. "Did you know that sometimes you yell out at night, too?" Steve lifted his gaze. "Did you know that sometimes you yell out at night, too?" "I do not," Chris automatically countered. "You do," Steve said. "I hear you." Chris shrugged. "Whatever," he said, picking at a cuticle. "Do you ever see her? M?" "How the hell do you know about M?" Chris asked. "That's the name you say at night." Steve stood up, his back against the metal bars of the cell. "I just wondered if you see her, like I see him." Chris thought about Jordan McAfee's warning, about rats that the cops put in your cell just to feel out your confessions. If he questioned, he would be questioned. And he was not sure that he wanted that sort of connection forged. But all the same time, Chris heard himself whisper, "What happened?" I was home alone with him, Steve whispered. Me and Liza had a big fight, and she stormed off to the hairdresser's where she worked. She wasn't even speaking to me by the time she left, but she told me to take care of the baby. I got pissed off, and I started drinking whatever was left in the fridge. And then he woke up, crying so loud that it was giving me a headache. Steve turned around, his forehead pressed against the bars. I tried to give him his bottle, and I changed his diaper, but he kept screaming. So I carried him, with him yelling all the time in my ear, and my head about split. Before I know it, I'm shaking him, telling him to just stop crying already. He took a deep, wet breath, and then I was shaking him, trying to get him to start crying. Steve spun around, his eyes gray and glazed. Do you know what it's like to hold this little person in your arms afterward, and to know that you were supposed to be the one to protect it? Chris swallowed past the constriction of his throat. What was his name? Benjamin, Steve said. Benjamin Tyler Vernon. M, Chris answered softly, a perfectly appropriate response. Emily Gold. M, Chris answered softly, a perfect response. Emily Gold. And I'm going to end there because it's moving on to another section. And so that was reading 12. I guess I probably need to do a discussion before I do another reading. We'll see. If there's been enough stuff that's gone on, then I'll go ahead and do a discussion on, let's see, so this would be 11 and 12. Yeah. Well, anyways, I'll have another discussion up soon. And yeah, thanks for hanging out today. I don't really know what else to say except goodbye, and I will see you in the next video. Again, I'm so enjoying this. I hope that you guys are enjoying it. We're almost halfway through now. Like, this is where we're at. So we still have plenty of readings to go. Don't worry, it's not over. We still have probably at least, I'm trying to think. Okay, if it took us like 3 weeks to get to this point, we still have like another 3 or 4 weeks probably at the pace that I'm going, which I'm not trying to hurry because I'm enjoying it just like you guys are. So, but anyways, I will see you in the next video. I love you guys. Have a fantastic day, night, afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you're at. Goodbye.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.